October 24, 1944, the Surigao Strait, Philippines. The sea is black and breathless. A pale moon hangs over the jagged silhouettes of warships moving through the strait. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel sliding silently toward destiny. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, officers peer into the mist. Their instruments hum faintly. Somewhere ahead, American invasion convoys churn the sea around Leyte Gulf. But reports insist the enemy's battleships are ancient wrecks, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. One officer smirks, whispering to his comrade, "Old ghosts cannot fight." But beyond the horizon, those ghosts are awake. The USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Tennessee, ships once gutted by Japanese torpedoes, now stand in line. Radar dishes sweeping the night like the eyes of vengeance. Their decks glimmer under red combat lights. Below, gunners rest their hands on levers and triggers. Men who remember the fires of 1941. Somewhere in the dark, distant flashes bloom. The first radar blip appears, engines rumble, and, for the first time in history, and the last, battleships prepare to face each other again. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor have returned. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean changed forever. The rising sun broke over Oahu as Japanese carrier planes, sleek, silver, and disciplined, sliced through the clouds toward Pearl Harbor. Below them lay the pride of the U.S. Navy, battleships anchored in neat rows, their decks still gleaming from peacetime routine. At 7:55 a.m., tranquility shattered. Torpedoes knifed through the harbor's still waters. The USS Arizona erupted in a fireball that tore through her forward magazines, lifting her hull from the sea before crushing it back down in flames. Oklahoma capsized. West Virginia, California, and Nevada sank or settled in the mud. Within minutes, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, once the symbol of American naval power, was reduced to a graveyard of smoke and twisted steel. The Japanese believed they had destroyed the American spirit along with its ships. In Tokyo, the news was received with jubilation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, warned privately, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." But his words were drowned by national pride. Across the Pacific, the Japanese war machine surged outward in a perfect arc, from Malaya and Singapore in the west to Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines in the east. The Imperial Navy dominated the seas with a confidence born from new technology and aggressive doctrine. Its capital ships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Fuso, were the largest and most heavily armed vessels ever constructed. In contrast, America's remaining surface fleet looked obsolete, a remnant of an earlier age of dreadnoughts and riveted armor. By early 1942, the Pacific was a Japanese lake. The Allied line broke at Java Sea, and the Philippines collapsed under relentless attack. The once mighty battleships that had symbolized America's global presence now rested broken in the shallows of Pearl Harbor. Newspapers called them the ghosts of the Pacific. Their names, Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, became eulogies. But beneath the mourning, quiet determination took root. Divers descended into the oily darkness of Pearl Harbor to assess what could be saved. Engineers worked day and night to pump out flooded compartments. In the shipyards of Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast, welders' torches illuminated the night sky like 1,000 stars of defiance. The Navy refused to let its fallen giants die. Where the Japanese saw wrecks, the Americans saw foundations. The slow resurrection began, one hull at a time. California was refloated in March 1942. West Virginia followed months later. Each recovery was an act of national therapy, an answer to humiliation. While America rebuilt, Japan expanded. Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet carved a vast empire. From Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Dutch East Indies to New Guinea. Japanese naval commanders boasted that their superiority would last a generation. In their view, the American battleship culture was dead, replaced by fast carriers and desperate improvisation. They were only half right. For though America's aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, began turning the tide at Midway in 1942, something deeper stirred in the shipyards back home. The United States possessed not only industry, but memory. And the men who had survived Pearl Harbor refused to forget. By the time Japan's war fortunes began to waver in late 1943, deep inside dry docks across the Pacific, the Ghost Fleet was stirring again. The old battleships, once symbols of American disaster, were being reborn, rearmed, and reimagined. The empire that had once mocked them would soon face their guns again. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy faced a monumental question. Were battleships still worth saving? The new era of naval warfare, ushered in by carrier strikes and long-range aircraft, seemed to have rendered these massive ships obsolete. But the answer came not from theory, but from resolve. American engineers and sailors refused to let them fade into history. The USS West Virginia lay submerged under 39 feet of water. Divers worked blind in oil-black darkness, sealing holes, cutting through twisted compartments, and retrieving the bodies of men still entombed within. Pumps thundered for weeks, slowly lifting her hull. By May 1942, she rose again, battered, scarred, but intact. The USS California followed, raised after months of effort. The Navy decided to rebuild her completely. What emerged from the dry docks was not the same ship that had been sunk, but a re-engineered war machine. Her superstructure was modernized, anti-aircraft batteries multiplied, and radar arrays now crowned her masts. Inside, new fire control systems replaced analog rangefinders. The ship that had once fought by eyesight would now fight by electronics. This transformation spread across the fleet. Tennessee and Maryland received similar upgrades, while Pennsylvania, veteran of the 1916 Atlantic Fleet, underwent heavy refits. Each ship represented a paradox, an old heart beating within new armor. They were slower than the Japanese Congo-class battlecruisers, but now deadlier in the dark. Their radar-guided guns able to find targets through night and fog. By mid-1943, America had become an arsenal of shipyards. What Japan built with pride, the United States rebuilt with scale. In California, Washington, and Pearl Harbor itself, sparks from welding torches lit the sky as shipwrights turned wrecks into weapons. The men who had once served aboard returned, some scarred, some limping, all determined. They found familiar corridors reshaped by steel and machinery, but the soul of the ships remained the same. The Navy reclassified these vessels as part of the 7th Fleets, bombardment and fire support groups, floating fortresses meant to soften island defenses before invasions. Their purpose was no longer to duel enemy battleships, but to deliver punishment from afar. Yet fate would decide otherwise. In 1944, as the Allied offensive swept across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Guam to Peleliu, the stage for the grand return of the battleships began to form. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur converged on a single target, the Philippines. The liberation of these islands would cut Japan's empire in half and open the road to Tokyo. For Japan, the loss of the Philippines would mean disaster. Their naval supply lines to the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra would be severed. Without fuel, even the Yamato herself would be useless. The Japanese High Command ordered a desperate plan to throw every available ship into one decisive battle to repel the American landings at Leyte Gulf. It was called Operation Shogo 1. On the American side, the old battleships were given a new honor. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was placed in command of the Bombardment and Fire Support Group. 6 resurrected veterans of Pearl Harbor, along with cruisers and destroyers. Their task: protect the southern approaches to Leyte Gulf through a narrow passage called the Surigao Strait. By October 1944, they were in position. Their hulls were patched, their guns gleamed, their crews waited in silence. For many aboard, it was more than just another mission. It was closure. They had seen their ships burn, their friends drown, their pride shattered. Now, under the humid Philippine night, they waited to confront the very empire that had once declared them dead. The Japanese, meanwhile, gathered their forces under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. His southern force, including the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, would attempt to slip through the Surigao Strait at night, catch the American invasion forces off guard, and strike a blow to rival Pearl Harbor. His officers were confident. They believed the Americans guarding the strait were second-rate, slow, outdated, and unworthy of modern battle. What they did not know was that these old battleships could now see in the dark. Their radars were alive, their crews disciplined, their gunners ready. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor were waiting, not for survival, but for redemption. They called themselves the Shipyard Sailors. They had not won glory at Midway or Guadalcanal. They had labored in the docks, scraping rust, rewiring circuits, cleaning compartments that had been soaked in death. Many of them had been aboard the ships when they sank. Some had barely escaped through flames and oil. Now, years later, they walked those same decks, restored but haunted. The USS West Virginia's crew was a living cross-section of the Navy's resilience. Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, who had been trapped in the sunken hull for more than 15 hours during Pearl Harbor, now served again on her bridge. Young sailors joined men twice their age, men who could still remember the sound of the torpedoes hitting. They worked beside each other in silence, bonded not by rank, but by memory. In letters home, some wrote of superstition, that the ships carried the spirits of those lost at Pearl Harbor. Others spoke of redemption. "This ship went down once," one gunner wrote, "but she'll never bow again." Life aboard was harsh. The tropical heat of the Philippines pressed into every compartment. Sweat mixed with oil, the air thick with gunpowder and salt. Yet there was pride, a quiet, unspoken pride. They knew they were the underdogs, the relics, the ships the Japanese had dismissed as ghosts. That knowledge fueled them. Each morning, drills echoed through the decks. Radar plotting, turret loading, damage control. The men learned to trust new technology that many had never seen before. Glowing radar scopes, electric rangefinders, automatic fire control computers. The young sailors adapted quickly. The older ones, veterans of a vanished era, learned to fight a new kind of war. Together, they became something rare. The bridge between 2 generations of naval warfare, and above all, they carried the memory of December 7th. When night fell over the Surigao Strait and the order came to stand to battle stations, they would not see the silhouettes of the Japanese fleet as strangers. They would see the past, and they would answer it. By 1944, the concept of the battleship had changed forever. No longer the centerpiece of fleets, they had been relegated to support roles, floating artillery for amphibious invasions. But Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf understood their hidden potential. When radar entered naval warfare, the balance between old and new shifted again. The Japanese Navy, though proud and skilled, still relied heavily on optical range-finding, the art of sight, timing, and instinct. Their gunners were trained to watch the fall of shells and adjust by eye. It was a noble craft, but in the darkness of Surigao Strait, it would become their undoing. Oldendorf's fleet, by contrast, fought by mathematics. Each ship was equipped with Mark 8 fire control radar, capable of tracking targets up to 20 miles away, even in complete darkness. For the first time in history, battleships could see without seeing. The ocean's horizon no longer defined the limit of their power. Tactically, the setup at Surigao Strait was a masterpiece. Oldendorf positioned his cruisers and destroyers at the mouth of the strait, forming a deadly crossing the T, the classic naval maneuver where a line of ships could fire broadsides across the enemy's advancing column. The Japanese would be forced to sail directly into converging lines of fire. Destroyers waited along both flanks to launch torpedoes. PT boats harassed the Japanese columns, reporting bearings and range. Every movement was coordinated by radar and radio, something the Japanese lacked. The old battleships, once seen as obsolete, were about to demonstrate that in modern warfare, technology and preparation outweighed speed and prestige. When Admiral Oldendorf reviewed his battle line that night, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania, he was not looking at relics. He was looking at weapons of precision, each manned by crews who knew both defeat and endurance. In their steel hulls lived the memory of loss. In their radar screens flickered the promise of revenge. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet steamed forward, confident that the Americans would never see them coming. They were wrong. The Second World War was the last time human eyes could see war in its purest form, and the first time machines began to see it better. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had quietly perfected the technology that would reshape naval warfare forever: radar. At Pearl Harbor in 1941, radar had been primitive, misunderstood, mistrusted, even ignored. But after the shock of that attack, the United States poured resources into transforming it from an experiment into an extension of human perception. On the resurrected battleships, radar became the ship's second sight. The USS West Virginia, sunk in 1941 and reborn in 1944, was among the most advanced. Her new Mark 8 fire control radar could detect a ship-sized target beyond the horizon, calculate range, bearing, and speed in real time, and feed the data directly into her fire control computers. In darkness or storm, the gunners could track a target invisible to the naked eye. When combined with the Mark 38 R-38 gun director and analog ballistic calculators, this technology turned the old dreadnoughts into precision weapons. It meant the difference between guessing and knowing, between a salvo that missed by hundreds of yards and one that struck home on the first shot. The Japanese did not have this advantage. Their ships relied on optical rangefinders and visual spotting, methods that worked in daylight but failed in the blackness of the Philippine night. When the two forces would finally meet, the difference between radar and sight would be the difference between life and death. In the Surigao Strait, radar didn't just guide shells, it guided fate. On the evening of October 24, 1944, aboard the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura studied his charts. His orders were clear: push through the Surigao Strait, crush the American invasion forces at Leyte Gulf, and turn the tide of war. He knew his mission was risky. His fleet was small: Yamashiro, her sister ship Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and a handful of destroyers. But Japanese naval doctrine revered courage above caution. Their naval history was built on audacity. From Tsushima in 1905 to the early victories of 1942, to Nishimura's officers, the thought of facing America's old battleships was almost laughable. Reports from Tokyo described them as slow, damaged, and outdated, museum pieces compared to the sleek, modern giants of the Imperial Navy. In their minds, Japan still held technological and spiritual superiority at sea. Their battleships were larger, their gunners disciplined, their torpedoes, the infamous Type 93 Long Lance, unmatched in range and power. Confidence replaced caution. On the eve of battle, some officers aboard Yamashiro toasted to the coming victory. But beneath that pride was a darker truth. Japan's Navy was running out of trained pilots, fuel, and radar equipment. Every loss was irreplaceable. Many of the ships now sailing toward the Surigao Strait did so knowing they might not return. But duty demanded obedience. Nishimura believed his southern attack would coincide with two other Japanese task forces, converging on Leyte Gulf from the north and center. In theory, the combined blow could trap and annihilate the American landing force. In practice, poor coordination, communication failures, and American air superiority ensured that each Japanese force would be isolated and destroyed in turn. As Nishimura's fleet entered the narrow waters of the Surigao Strait, they sailed straight into an ambush, one prepared by the very ships they had dismissed as obsolete. Their underestimation would become a lesson written in fire across the Philippine Sea. War is fought with weapons, but it is remembered for the reasons men fight. For the crews of the resurrected American battleships, the Battle of Surigao Strait was not just another engagement. It was personal. They had lived through humiliation, through smoke and loss, through the disbelief that the world's greatest navy could be crippled in a single morning. Many had seen comrades trapped below decks as their ships rolled and sank. They had carried that guilt for years. The chance to return, to fight the same enemy under the same flag, aboard the same ship, was something few in history ever experienced. There was a spiritual current aboard those vessels that night. Not revenge, exactly. Something deeper. Duty mixed with remembrance. When they loaded shells into the great 16-inch guns, they did so with precision, not hatred. Every motion was ritual. Radar operators watched glowing dots crawl across their scopes, the shapes of the enemy closing in. Gunners stood ready at their stations, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from memory. When the command came, "Open fire!" It would mark not only the beginning of a naval engagement, but the closing of a wound 3 years old. The Japanese had sought to destroy America's battleships at Pearl Harbor. Now, those same ships would destroy the pride of the Imperial Navy. It was not vengeance that drove them. It was resurrection. And as the two fleets drew closer in the night, radar screens pulsing like heartbeats, both sides were about to enter history's final battleship duel. The ghosts of the past were aligning their guns. The Philippine night was heavy and wet. Sheets of rain swept across the narrow waters of the Surigao Strait, a confined channel less than 20 miles wide, the only passage through which Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force could reach the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. To the north, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf watched his radar screens aboard the USS Louisville. He had been given the responsibility of guarding the southern entrance to the Gulf, a position that would become the setting of the final battleship duel in human history. His ships lay in perfect formation, stretching across the strait like a steel wall. In the darkness, radar screens glowed faintly. The USS West Virginia's operators reported blips approaching from the south, slow, steady, and in column. The Japanese were coming, but Nishimura did not know what awaited him. He believed he was facing a small covering force, not the full weight of Oldendorf's line. His battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, steamed forward in line-ahead formation, their decks lined with gunners, their searchlights covered, their torpedoes primed. Behind them trailed the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers, Asagumo, Michishio, Yamagumo, and Shigure. Each ship carried torpedoes that could outrange any Allied weapon. But the confined waters of the strait made them vulnerable, and the Americans knew every mile of that channel by radar and reconnaissance. Oldendorf's plan was textbook naval perfection. He had deployed his destroyers along both flanks of the strait, waiting in ambush with torpedoes. Behind them, two columns of cruisers and battleships stretched across the northern end of the passage. The Japanese would be forced to advance straight into a killing zone, their course illuminated by gunfire and explosions. It was a maneuver as old as naval warfare itself, crossing the T. The Japanese column would sail into the jaws of a fleet positioned perpendicular to its course. Every American gun could bear. The Japanese could fire only forward. At 22:36, the first contact reports came in. PT boats, small, nimble, and expendable, had engaged the Japanese column at the southern entrance. Their torpedoes missed, but their radios crackled with bearings and speed. They were the tripwires of the ambush. Nishimura pressed on. His officers urged caution. The narrow waters were filled with torpedo wakes and flashes, but he could not turn back. His orders were to push through and reach Leyte at dawn. In Tokyo, the High Command awaited news of victory. At WWII, as the Japanese formation entered the northern stretch of the strait, American destroyers struck. USS Rimae, Melvin, McGowan, and Monson fired spreads of torpedoes that streaked toward the Japanese line. Moments later, violent flashes tore the night apart. Fuso was hit, one, possibly two torpedoes amidships. Flames rose from her deck. The Japanese column faltered. Radio communication broke down in the chaos. Some officers reported the ship exploding and breaking in two. Others claimed she burned for nearly an hour before sinking. Whatever the truth, the once mighty Fuso was gone, swallowed by the black water she sought to dominate. Still, Yamashiro advanced. Her captain, Takao Koyanagi, kept her heading north, determination overriding sense. Around them, destroyers were struck, burning, sinking. Yet, the Japanese flagship pressed on, guns loaded, unaware that the full American battle line was waiting just miles ahead. On the USS West Virginia, radar operators tracked the approach with mechanical calm. Every few seconds, the blips crept closer. Fire control computers whirred softly, calculating range, deflection, and lead angles. At 0350, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order. Prepare to open fire. 6 battleships turned their turrets south. West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, were now aligned across the strait in a perfect arc. For a moment, silence reigned. The sea hissed under the rain. Men waited at their guns, hands trembling slightly over triggers. Below deck, loaders stood ready beside elevators stacked with shells, armor-piercing giants weighing over a ton each. Radar confirmed range, 22,800 yards. Bearing, steady. Speed, constant. At 0353, the gunnery officer aboard West Virginia announced the words that would echo through naval history. Open fire! Radar control! The night exploded. From her 9 16-inch guns, West Virginia unleashed the first salvo, a thunderous concussion that rolled across the sea and back against the mountains of Leyte. Each shell screamed through the air, trailing sparks before plunging into the darkness toward the Japanese flagship. Seconds later, columns of water and fire erupted around Yamashiro. Within moments, 5 more battleships joined in. Dozens of heavy guns thundered in unison, turning night into day. Cruisers and destroyers added their own salvos, the entire northern horizon flashing white and red. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the old American battleships were firing not at the sky, but at the enemy who had once destroyed them. Every recoil, every blast, was both tactical and symbolic. The ghosts reclaiming their power. Yamashiro returned fire, her own great guns belching orange fireballs into the night. But her salvos fell short. Without radar, she was blind. Shells slammed into her decks, tearing through her bridge, ripping open her hull. Her gunners fought on, loading and firing amid smoke and screams. Destroyers tried to close the range, launching desperate torpedo attacks, but American fire cut them down one by one. The strait became a corridor of destruction, tracer rounds, flames, sinking wrecks. At 04:05, Yamashiro was struck by a series of 14 and 16-inch shells. Fire spread from bow to stern. Her speed dropped. Within minutes, she was listing heavily, her deck awash. Yet, even as she sank, her guns continued to fire. The old battleships had found their vengeance. But the night was not over. The sea still burned, wreckage still drifted, and Admiral Oldendorf's line prepared to deliver the final, devastating blows. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor had returned, and they were not finished yet. The Surigao Strait was a blazing inferno. Shells screamed overhead, explosions echoed from the cliffs, and the sea itself seemed to burn. In the center of the storm was the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, once a symbol of naval pride, now a solitary fortress staggering through waves of fire. Her decks were a shambles of wreckage. Lifeboats were smashed, anti-aircraft guns twisted from their mounts, and her upper bridge, where Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura stood, was engulfed in smoke. The American battle line continued its measured, devastating barrage. Each broadside from the West Virginia sent 9 16-inch shells arcing into the night. Tennessee and California added 12 14-inch guns each. The Maryland and Mississippi joined in, their salvos flashing white across the horizon. In the darkness, American radar-directed fire was mercilessly precise. Shell after shell found its mark, tearing massive holes in Yamashiro's armor. She was pounded from every direction, hit at least a dozen times by shells heavier than cars, and dozens more by 8-inch and 6-inch rounds from cruisers. On the bridge, Nishimura refused to leave his post. Witnesses later described him standing calmly amid the chaos, giving final orders in an even voice. "Steady course," he said. "We go on." His words were carried away by the roar of the next salvo. Behind Yamashiro, the scene was utter disintegration. The heavy cruiser Mogami had taken several hits from American 8-inch shells. Her decks were ablaze, her engines crippled. Destroyers, Michishio and Yamagumo, had been struck by torpedoes and were sinking fast. Only Shigure, the lucky destroyer that had somehow survived every engagement of the war so far, managed to slip away into the night, battered but alive. By 04:10, Yamashiro was alone. Her main guns fired one last defiant salvo, their barrels glowing red from heat. It was the last time a battleship would ever fire its guns in a line battle. Aboard West Virginia, gunners watched the radar returns fade. The enemy flagship slowed, her outline breaking apart on their screens. At 04:19, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order. "Cease fire." The thunder ended. After nearly half an hour of continuous bombardment, silence swept over the strait, broken only by the crackle of flames and the hiss of steam venting from dying ships. Moments later, Yamashiro capsized to port. Her great hull rolled over, her keel visible in the lightning flashes. Then she slid beneath the surface, taking with her Admiral Nishimura, most of her crew, and the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The last battleship duel in history was over. At dawn, the smoke cleared to reveal a sea littered with burning oil, wreckage, and drifting men. American PT boats cruised cautiously among the debris, searching for survivors. Out of more than 7,000 Japanese sailors who had entered the strait, only a few hundred would live to see the sunrise. Admiral Oldendorf stood on the bridge of the Louisville, his face drawn and quiet. Around him, the battered American ships rocked gently in the morning tide. The battle had been one-sided, almost surgical, but its significance was enormous. For Oldendorf, the engagement was not just a tactical victory, it was the closing of a circle. His battleships, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Mississippi, had all been present at Pearl Harbor, crippled or sunk on that terrible morning 3 years before. Now, under his command, those same ships had risen again, rebuilt, refitted, and armed with radar that turned darkness into daylight. They had returned to face the enemy who once destroyed them, and they had prevailed. In that sense, the Battle of Surigao Strait was not only a military triumph, but an act of resurrection. Each American battleship had its own ghosts. On the West Virginia, men who had escaped the burning decks of Pearl Harbor now stood at the same gun turrets, firing at the nation that had once left them for dead. On the California, a petty officer who had nearly drowned in December 1941 manned the shell hoist that sent round after round into Yamashiro's hull. The gunfire of the night had been more than battle, it was catharsis. The Ghost Fleet of Pearl Harbor had avenged itself, but the battle also marked something else, the twilight of the battleship era. Surigao Strait would be remembered as the last time in history that battleships faced one another in direct combat. From then on, naval power would belong to aircraft carriers, submarines, and radar-guided missiles. Steel giants that once ruled the seas had fired their final salvos and slipped, one by one, into history. As the sun rose over Leyte, the calm waters of the Surigao Strait bore silent witness to the end of an age. Floating debris burned faintly in the golden light. Men on deck looked across the sea where their enemy had vanished and said nothing. Oldendorf wrote later in his report, "The enemy was annihilated. We had crossed the T as Nelson would have done, but I take no joy in it. They fought bravely, and they died bravely." The battle was over. The southern Japanese force had ceased to exist, and the name Yamashiro joined the long roll of ships lost to history. In the distance, faint echoes of thunder still rolled over the horizon, not from guns, but from the dawn storm breaking over the sea. It sounded, perhaps, like applause from the ghosts of the battleship age, fading forever. Even as Yamashiro slipped beneath the waves, another Japanese force was entering the Surigao Strait, unaware that the battle they were rushing toward was already lost. Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, commanding the Second Striking Force, had set out from the west with a small contingent. 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Ashigara, one light cruiser, Abukuma, and 4 destroyers. His mission was to reinforce Nishimura's advance and strike at the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. But as his ships approached the narrow waters of the strait, Shima saw a sight that no admiral could have prepared for. The horizon ahead was aflame, the sea glowing red from oil fires, the air filled with drifting smoke, and the echo of distant explosions. The radio was chaos. Transmissions overlapped, voices screamed, coordinates contradicted one another. Shima peered through the night binoculars and muttered to his bridge officers, "The strait burns like hell itself." At 04:45, Shima's lookouts sighted wreckage, vast, burning debris stretching across the channel. Some believed they saw enemy ships. Others insisted it was Nishimura's fleet retreating. In the darkness and confusion, with radar unreliable and communication cut off, Shima's formation began to falter. Suddenly, the heavy cruiser Nachi, leading the column, reported an obstacle dead ahead. A ship, listing heavily, drifting across their path. Before any evasive orders could be given, the 2 vessels collided. It was Mogami, Nishimura's crippled cruiser, trying desperately to limp northward. The impact tore open Mogami's starboard side, crushing lifeboats and ripping steel plating. Nachi's bow was mangled, flooding compartments instantly. The collision symbolized everything about Japan's disintegrating naval campaign: confusion, miscommunication, and the ruin of what had once been the world's most feared fleet. Aboard Mogami, fires raged uncontrollably. Her captain, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, ordered his crew to abandon ship. A few hours later, under repeated air attack, Mogami exploded, taking hundreds of sailors with her. Retreat under fire. Realizing the scale of the disaster, Admiral Shima made a painful decision. At 05 RIR, he ordered his surviving ships to retreat southward, the only time in the battle when a Japanese commander still had that choice. As his ships turned, they came under sporadic fire from American cruisers and destroyers still stationed across the mouth of the strait. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Near misses threw columns of spray over Nachi's decks. Shima's retreat was not dignified. It was a desperate flight. The fleet that had once been described as the Second Strike was now reduced to limping through burning oil and wreckage. Its formation shattered by 06 Cedo. As the first light of dawn touched the coastline of Leyte, Shima's survivors finally cleared the southern entrance of the Surigao Strait. Behind them, the sea still burned. They had lost contact with Nishimura's force completely. And in truth, there was nothing left to contact. The Battle of Surigao Strait was supposed to be one arm of a grand Japanese operation, a coordinated attack from north, center, and south designed to crush the American landings at Leyte. But with Nishimura's force annihilated and Shima's scattered, the southern pincer had ceased to exist. The center force under Admiral Kurita, which included the mighty Yamato, was still fighting to the north. But without the southern fleet's diversion, the Americans could concentrate their power freely. By the end of the morning, Admiral Oldendorf's task force stood unchallenged at the mouth of the strait, their ships silhouetted against a rising sun streaked with smoke. Around them drifted the final evidence of victory: oil-slick waters, shattered masts, lifeboats half-burned, and a few dazed survivors clinging to wreckage. No one cheered. There was no triumphal music. The sailors of the U.S. Navy had fought like machines through the night. And now, in daylight, they were human again, staring at what war really meant. A junior officer aboard Tennessee later wrote in his journal, "The sea was calm again by sunrise, but in that calm floated the remains of men and ships that once ruled the Pacific. It was like standing among ghosts. The southern sky brightened, and with it came the full weight of what had happened. The great battleships that had once been the measure of a navy's strength had met each other in their last duel, and one by one had fallen silent. But the war was not yet over. The same morning, far to the north, the carrier Yamato's sister ships and Admiral Kurita's powerful center force approached the Sibuyan Sea, still intent on reaching Leyte Gulf. The Americans did not yet know it, but another storm was gathering, one that would test their victory anew. And with that, the story of the old battleships would continue, beyond the fire and smoke of Surigao Strait, into the dawn of a new kind of naval war. The sun rose over the Surigao Strait like a reluctant witness. A pale gold light spread across the waves, revealing what the night had hidden. The sea was littered with wreckage: twisted steel, wooden planks, lifebuoys, burned life jackets, and oil-slick waves shimmering like liquid shadow. In the stillness, the silence was deafening. The roar of gunfire had ceased, replaced by the low hiss of burning oil. Occasionally, an ammunition magazine deep within a sunken ship detonated, sending a single plume of smoke spiraling upward, as if the sea itself was exhaling the ghosts of the night. American PT boats and destroyers moved cautiously through the debris fields, scanning for survivors. The order had been given: rescue any man still afloat, friend or foe. Most of those they found were Japanese, oil-blackened, barely conscious, clinging to wreckage. Many refused help, believing rescue dishonorable. Some tried to swim away. A few, delirious, whispered prayers as sailors pulled them aboard. Aboard the USS Richard P. Leary, one young seaman wrote later in his diary, "We picked up 4 Japanese. They were quiet. Not angry, not afraid, just empty. I don't think they believed they were still alive." When the full reports were compiled, the scale of destruction stunned even seasoned officers. The Japanese Southern Force had effectively ceased to exist. Battleship Yamashiro, sunk with nearly 1,500 men, including Admiral Nishimura. Heavy cruiser Mogami, crippled. Later destroyed by air attack, approximately 700 dead. Destroyers Asagamo, Yamagamo, Michishio, Fuso, all lost. Only one destroyer, Shigure, escaped, damaged but afloat. Out of nearly 7,000 Japanese sailors, fewer than 300 survived. Admiral Shima's group fared little better. One cruiser badly damaged, one destroyer sunk, and the rest limping back toward Borneo. For the Americans, the losses were astonishingly light. A few destroyers and PT boats were damaged by friendly fire or near misses. Fewer than 40 American sailors had been killed. It was one of the most one-sided naval engagements in history, not because of luck, but because of evolution. The U.S. Navy had mastered radar, night tactics, and coordinated fire control. The Japanese had entered the battle with courage, but armed with methods from an earlier age. Far away in Manila, the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Southwest Area Fleet waited for news. At first, garbled reports suggested victory, that the American invasion fleet had been caught and shattered. But by the morning of October 26th, the truth began to seep in. Messages came in broken, contradictory fragments. Yamashiro sunk. Mogami aflame. No word from Nishimura. The full report arrived 2 days later, when Shima's battered ships limped back into port. His face was ashen as he delivered his account. He had entered the Surigao Strait expecting to strike a blow for Japan's survival, and had found only ruin. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received the summary with disbelief. The Southern Force, one of the last battle-ready formations of Japan's once mighty fleet, had been annihilated in a single night. It was more than a defeat. It was the end of a doctrine, the death of an idea, that battleships, honor, and courage could overcome technology and modern tactics. For Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the American 7th Fleet's battle line, the mood was subdued. There was no celebration, no triumphal speeches. When a reporter later asked how he had achieved such a flawless victory, Oldendorf replied with dry humility, "We just crossed the T. They came and we were ready. That's all." In his official report, he wrote simply, "The enemy's southern force was annihilated. Our ships performed magnificently. I am proud, but not joyful. The old battleships had done what they were rebuilt to do. They had avenged Pearl Harbor and proved their worth one last time." But their commander understood something deeper, that their era was ending. Even as the fires of Surigao still burned, hundreds of miles to the north, the great aircraft carrier battles continued off Cape Engano and Samar. The future of naval warfare was already being written in the sky, not on the sea. And yet, on this quiet October morning, as smoke drifted across the strait and the battered hulls of the West Virginia and California glowed orange in the sunrise, one could not help but feel that something far larger had ended here. Not just a battle, but an age. In the days that followed, a few Japanese sailors were recovered from the open sea. They were taken aboard American destroyers, silent, starved, half-burned from oil and salt water. Among them were men from Yamashiro and Mogami, their uniforms shredded, eyes hollow from exhaustion. When interrogated, most refused to speak. Some gave only brief, broken statements. "We saw Admiral Nishimura on the bridge, still standing. We never saw Fuso again." The sea caught fire. One survivor told his American interrogator quietly, "It was as if the gods had abandoned us." For the U.S. sailors who had fought that night, those words lingered. Many could not shake the memory of what they had witnessed. Ships burning so fiercely they seemed to glow from within, men jumping into oil fires, the sound of steel tearing underwater. In letters written home weeks later, some of them expressed a conflicted pride. They had avenged Pearl Harbor. But what they saw at Surigao did not feel like victory. It felt like judgment. When official confirmation of the defeat reached Tokyo, the reaction within the Japanese Naval Command bordered on disbelief. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which Surigao Strait was only one part, had been intended to reverse Japan's collapse in the Pacific, a grand operation to destroy the American invasion of the Philippines. Instead, it had cost them 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At Surigao alone, 2 of the oldest and most storied ships in the Imperial fleet, Yamashiro and Fuso, had been erased. In Tokyo's naval offices, the walls once decorated with portraits of great admirals like Togo and Yamamoto now hung with silence. Officers studied the maps, saw the empty columns where ships had once been listed, and said little. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific for the first half of the war, was no longer a coherent fighting force. Its surface fleet was shattered beyond repair. Even Admiral Toyoda, the combined fleet's commander, admitted privately, "We have no more ships to lose. The Empire has gambled everything, and the sea has taken it all." From that moment onward, Japan's war would be fought by air and desperation. Its surface ships would spend the rest of the conflict in harbors, hiding from American air power or scuttled in shallow bays. For the Americans, Surigao Strait was far more than just another victory. It was vindication. Every battleship in Oldendorf's line, except Mississippi, had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Now, just 3 years later, they had returned from the depths, rebuilt and reborn, to deliver the final blow in the last great surface engagement in history. The symbolism was powerful. The West Virginia, once resting in 12 meters of mud in December 1941, had risen again to lead the line. Her radar-directed guns fired the first salvos of the battle, and the last that night. On board, many of her crew were the same men who had survived her sinking. They had walked her decks underwater. Now they walked them under fire, and emerged victorious. When word of the victory reached Pearl Harbor, where the ships had once burned, the mood was somber but proud. Officers who had seen the wreckage 3 years earlier could hardly believe the reports. "The ghosts have fired again," one admiral remarked, and they did not miss. The ships themselves became living monuments, steel memorials that had avenged their own destruction. Naval. Historians would later call Surigao Strait the sunset of the WWII battleships. No engagement like it would ever happen again. The age of radar, submarines, and aircraft carriers had begun, and with it, the battleship became a relic of an older, more human kind of war. But in that final night battle, something timeless had occurred. The courage of the old ships, the precision of new technology, the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, all converged in one place, for one last act. For the Japanese sailors who went down with Yamashiro, it was an honorable end. For the Americans who fired upon her, it was closure. And for history, it was the moment the world turned from the thunder of guns to the silence of radar screens. As the surviving ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet steamed out of the strait, their decks blackened by cordite and dawn mist, the men who stood watch looked astern, toward the still-burning sea, and understood, even without words, that they had witnessed the end of something that would never come again. In the long story of war at sea, few moments mark such a clean divide between eras. The night of October 24, 1944, was one of them. When the guns of the old battleships fell silent at Surigao Strait, the world they represented fell silent too. For centuries, naval power had been measured by the weight of a ship's armor, the size of its guns, and the courage of the men who stood behind them. At Surigao, all those things still existed. Yet they were outmatched by something invisible. Radar beams pulsing through the night, cold mathematics guiding steel through darkness. It was a battle where the past met the future, and the future won. The American sailors who fought there did not think of themselves as living symbols. They were simply doing their duty, defending their comrades, avenging their fallen. Yet, when the smoke cleared, history had chosen them to close the book on the battleship age. Their ships, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, had once been wrecks resting in Hawaiian mud. Now, they were instruments of precision, their every shot guided by electricity and computation. They had gone from relics to revolutionaries in less than 3 years, and when their guns finally ceased fire, the Pacific was changed forever. For Japan, Surigao Strait was more than a tactical defeat. It was the twilight of a spirit. The Bushido Code that had carried its sailors into hopeless battle met the modernity of total industrial war, and could not prevail. But in their courage, there remained a terrible beauty. Men who sailed knowingly into death, bound by loyalty to duty and empire, refusing surrender even in the face of the inevitable. Today, the sea above Surigao Strait is calm again. Fishermen drift where the Yamashiro and Fuso sleep beneath the silt. Occasionally, sonar images reveal ghostly shapes, turrets still pointing north, guns frozen in their final defiance. The water is quiet, but beneath it rests the last echo of an age, when nations measured power in thunder. If you listen closely to the waves, you might still hear it. A faint vibration carried through time. The echo of the moment when old steel roared one last time against the coming of the modern world. The night the old battleships fired again, and the world of war was never the same.